Hey, John, welcome to Soul Talks. We are so glad to have this conversation with you. Really appreciate it.
Well, anytime I get the chance to connect with you guys, that's a gift, and it's a fabulous topic. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, we want to introduce you to our audience. I think most of our people know you, but just in case you don't know John's background, he's got a Master's of Divinity and a doctorate in psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He served as a pastor for many years, and he currently leads the ministry Become New. And his passion is to help people know God in an interactive, life-transforming way. And John is the author of a new book, a great book called Steps, a guide to transforming your life when willpower isn't enough. And Christy and I have really enjoyed this book and benefited from it. And John, you've articulated some things that we've been learning to live into for some years and teaching, but you've added a lot for us. And I know for many people who are reading this, and we're trusting our Soul Talks friends, you're going to want to get this book. It's coming out of just your life with Jesus, your apprenticeship to Jesus that we really admire, John. Just the appreciated your authenticity, as you've been serving the Lord through the ups and downs of life and the challenges of life. And it's really amazing how you have drawn in on the 12 steps for your own life. And you've been cooking in this for a while and some years. And
Yes.
now the Lord led you to write on it. So, yeah, tell us about that.
Uh, I actually had a very good friend, a guy named Rick Blackman. We went through psychology school together, and I'd been thinking about this topic for a long, long time, starting way back during school days when I was first exposed to AA, and then Dallas Willard, who you guys know, would periodically write, both in The Divine Conspiracy and Renovation of the Heart, that if the church ever gets spiritual formation right, it will look a lot like the 12 steps. And so I would teach on it, learn from it. And then a good friend of mine, Rick, said to me, I think God's calling you to write a book like this. And Rick doesn't usually say things like that, but I thought, well, I should
Yeah.
pay attention to that. And for sure, going through pain and difficulty in my own life made me much more keenly aware of God, I need you desperately. And of course, that's deeply connected to step one. So it brings together lots of streams for me.
Yeah, you've got a great launching point in your book where you say, just a really simple but profound phrasing. I can't, but God can. I think I'll let him. And tell us how that, in some ways, is the theme of the book.
Yeah, in AA, they have a million sticky sayings,
Yeah.
and that will sometimes sound a little bit glib or trite for folks, but it's for a real significant reason. In fact, as Dr. Bob, one of the co-founders, his final words to his partner, Bill W., was keep it simple, Bill. And it's very much like Jesus. Jesus was a real smart guy, but he made sure to communicate things in a way that everybody can understand because it's about life change and the stakes are very, very high, life or death, heaven or hell. And so in AA, they work really hard to try to make the ideas accessible and sticky. And so the first three steps, which interestingly enough, as Dallas talks about how change takes place, he would use the little acronym VIM, Vision, Intention, Method. And the first two steps are really vision, and the second step is intention. And then 4 through 12 are all about method. But the first step is admitted that we were powerless over. That's the only time alcohol is used in the 12 steps, but we might say over our fatal attraction to do what's wrong, and our lives have become unmanageable. So powerless and unmanageability. And then the second step is the step of hope, came to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Interestingly, not restore us to sobriety, but our problem is sanity, living with reality. And then the third step, made the decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. So those three steps will sometimes be shortened in a very memorable way in 12-step communities. I can't. He can. I think I'll let him. And, for anybody who's listening to us, if you don't take anything else away from this conversation, everybody can carry that with you. And that can be a wonderful prayer. That can be a wonderful thought all through the day. Certainly, there's lots of stuff we can do. God gave us wills, so our willpower is important. But it cannot overcome sin, can't heal my own brokenness. I'm not in control of the universe or other people. And if my little ego is on the throne, I'm in big trouble. I can't, but he can. I think I'll let him.
That's right. So good. Thank you. And one of the things I've appreciated about you, John, is just seeing you live this. One of the other things that Dallas taught was not throwing away your trials, but
Hmm.
that they're a part of our discipleship, our apprenticeship to
Yeah.
Jesus as well. And I've been seeing you live that out, and I've appreciated your being a wounded healer and you inviting others into the fellowship of the withered hand, you call it,
Yeah.
this authentic community of people where we can be vulnerable, where we don't need to be perfect, where we can be in process because we are following Jesus and we're trusting his grace to be enough in our weakness. And Bill and I are so blessed to get to be in a community like this that we lead in our soul shepherding retreats where pastors, leaders come and they have a safe place to be honest. And it makes such a difference in our lives as we do that, as we process together, as we humble ourselves before God, as we're able to be emotionally honest with ourselves and God and others. And I would just love to hear a little bit. You've been working on this book. I mean, it seems like it was 3 years ago I first heard you mention it. And I respect the time you took
Mm.
to write it and to practice it yourself and to live it before you started to talk about it and put it out there. But I would love to just hear what's been the biggest fruit in your relationship with Christ personally of
Mm.
really working this, and like another Dallas saying, serve what you're cooking. You've been cooking
Yes.
this a while and now
Yep.
you're serving it. You've been serving it some while you've been cooking it on your
Mhm.
Become New Me podcast and videos. But I'd love to hear personally, where are you seeing fruit in your life?
Yeah. If you go to an AA meeting, and if anybody's interested in this, the idea of the book is really uh, that the 12 steps of AA came out of a Christian fellowship. It was called the Oxford Group about 100 years ago. And the original name was a first century Christian fellowship. And it was just an attempt to recapture discipleship. What does it mean to follow Jesus by practices like surrender and self-examination and confession to somebody else and making amends to people and living a life of service and prayer and so. And then Bill W. and then Dr. Bob and then other people became part of an Oxford group and found as they entered into a way of life that's just robust discipleship, oh, by the way, they got sobriety thrown in. And it's kind of sobering to think how often would that happen in most of our churches. So it really is just uh, a way, an organic, kind of empirically proven way of following Jesus through which we receive power. And I think probably um, if I were to say what's meant the most to me over these last several years, it has been really the first step, just to be able to acknowledge powerlessness and come to God in powerlessness. And, there's just that strange paradox that when we gather together on the basis of our gifts and strengths and merit badges, there's not much power that flows.
Mhm.
But when I have a conversation with somebody and we both come in the fellowship of suffering and weakness and need, um, we're naming reality and the kind of power flows through that. Um, I was talking to a guy who has taught in 12-step circles for several decades, and he said actually the problems that most religion and most churches have is we have a wimpy step one. And if you have a wimpy step one, then you're going to have a wimpy steps 2 through 12. And it's part of what they learned was it's a deeply experienced, deeply felt need for God. In AA, another little saying they will sometimes talk about the gift of desperation, God.
Wow.
That the more desperate somebody is, actually, the closer they are to being able to experience God. And we see that in the New Testament. So for myself, I have felt a stronger sense of powerlessness, and often my life is manageable. I can't fix my pain. I can't fix my family. There's all kinds of stuff that I can't fix. And to be able to have conversations with people on that basis has been enormously helpful. It's kind of a weird thing that, I think probably earlier in ministry, I would think about ministry as more something I was supposed to try to do out of whatever giftedness I have.
Mhm.
But much more seems to happen when I meet people in the valley of weakness
Mm.
than, when I think I'm using strength. So that that has just meant a lot to me because I have needed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Chris and I have prayed for you a number of times over the years, particularly after the recent season was so difficult. And you said publicly, gosh, I just wasn't sure I'd get to speak again, which when I first heard you say that was unimaginable to me, having experienced your speaking so many times and just been so blessed by the way God's gifted you and anointed you and just speaks through you with transforming insights and engaging stories and the best of which are in your new book, Steps. I mean, it's just you've packed it full. It's like you've given us a new big book for people in recovery and all of us, like you say in your podcast. Hi, I'm John. I'm a sinner,
Yeah.
and yeah. So I just the way that you've been living into this, like Christy said, is it's encouraging. It's giving us who have been learning from you. Sort of, we get to be, in some ways, in the fellowship of the withered hand with you, which is what the Lord seems to really have birthed in you through your difficult season.
Well, it's very striking. A question that gets posed by pastors, Christian writers a ton if they ever go to an AA meeting. And if anybody's watching, if you want to, if you look online, AA meetings will have a little letter after them, either C or O. C means closed, so you have to be an addict to go to that meeting. O means open, and that means anybody can go to it. And it's well worth going to at least one. Very often, somebody who works in the church goes to an AA meeting, and there's just a rawness and an openness, and people are very transparent about where they're wrestling, where they've struggled, where they've messed up. Um, there's this tremendous sense of embracing everybody that comes in. Another little saying from AA is the worse your story, the warmer you're welcome. Like, who does that sound like? Who in the New Testament was that kind of a guy? Um, so the question that will get asked is, how come church can't be more like that? How come church can't be more like an AA meeting? And it's often posed rhetorically, like if we just try harder, we could do it. But I think it's a great question. And the answer is it can, but only if those of us who go to church are willing to be more like alcoholics.
Mhm.
And that's where one of the strange paradoxical gifts of addiction is, I think it's very much living out where God says, my strength is made perfect in weakness.
Mhm.
And it's the very weakness of addiction that drives people to say, I gotta have God. There's no use trying to look any better than I actually am anymore. And so there's this rawness to it. And we have a hard time doing that in church. We tend to confuse spiritual maturity with meaning that I don't have a real time desperate need for God to keep me from sin anymore. And one of the statements in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book, is uh, we have at most a daily reprieve based on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. So
Mhm.
there's just no sense of, uh, I've been going to meetings for 30 years, so I'm a pillar, I'm mature. Another common saying in AA is they'll sometimes ask, who's got the most sobriety? Somebody that hasn't had a drink for 30 years or somebody that hasn't had a drink for a week? And the answer is whoever woke up first this morning.
Mhm.
So I think in the church, um, if there's a way to create the kind of freedom for all of us to show up in real life, real time, uh, I need God, I'm a mess without God. That's where the power is. Yeah.
I speak often at a church. Recently, Chris and I have done it together, where they specialize in recovery ministry, and so they have a Friday night recovery meeting, and everybody meets together in the church. So we've had, like 300 addicts in the room.
Mm.
And then they break into the 12-step small groups, after that by particular issue of need, different addictions, compulsions, codependency, relationship problems, et cetera. And I begin those talks saying, hi, I'm Bill, I'm a workaholic. And, then they get the hi, Bill. And, that's how we are in a group like that.
Yeah.
And I decided years ago, I'm just going to bring that into my other relationships in ministry. And so we have a soul shepherding retreat session that we begin just that way. I just say, it's first things I say in the session, hi, I'm Bill, I'm a workaholic.
Yeah.
And then I unpack that story. And when in my early 30s is when I realized I was a workaholic. I was working full-time as a psychologist in private practice, leading a day hospital clinic, and writing books on the side, driven by hidden feelings of shame and emptiness. And when I tell my story, I say, I have the same capacity to work now that I did then. I love work, and I'm vulnerable to overwork. And I'm thankful to be in recovery one day at a time, only because I've learned to, what you're calling the fellowship of the withered hand, but I've learned to be honest about that inner shame and that inner emptiness, obviously, particularly in my close relationships and my support system. But as I've received, continuing grace in that and growth in that, back and forth progress and challenges, but then I'm able to share that story with others. And what helped me was the kind of stuff that you're writing about in part of your book, but it was Christy, you being really honest with me, and not only with the truth, but with your feeling, your emotion, your hurt. And just me waking up, I got two little kids at home. And then when Christy was pregnant with our third and last child, she says to me, here's how she told me, Bill, would you like to co-author the lives of our three children with me? And she used an emotional word picture, co-author, because I was writing
Yeah.
books, and that was my big dream,
Yep.
was to write books that bless people like I've been blessed by books. And that was when I realized, my work is out of control,
Yeah.
and I need help with this.
Yeah.
And so it's a story that a big part of what you're writing about is learning loving attachments with God and others, because when the alcoholic or the workaholic or the food addict or the codependent, we've got these unhealthy attachments to things or stuff or toxic relationships, and we need to get that attachment to a loving God. So
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Often when people hear about the 12 steps, they assume, well, that's just something for addicts who are into recovery. And the reality is, again, like they came from the church needs them back now. We need a way of life to give us power, because we all get stuck. And Ian Cron's written a real good book about the 12 steps also. And he talks about an addiction as an attachment to continued use of a substance or a behavior that's mood altering that persists despite negative consequences for myself or for others. And I think you're exactly right. That can be work, it can be approval addiction, it can be pleasure addiction. We can be addicted to safety and security, money, all kinds of issues that we get stuck with, and we do not have the power to free ourselves.
And we can get stuck to multiple addictions. I mean, all those that you mentioned, I could skip around from one to the
That's
other.
right.
Oh, this one isn't working anymore. I'm going to try this one
Yeah.
until I wake up again and re-enter a 2-minute attachment to Jesus and
Yeah,
him.
no, and just understanding like when Jesus said things like, whoever sins in John 8 is a slave to sin.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's addiction or attachment language. I say you become enslaved by it. But if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And so we all need to be set free. None of us is powerful enough to do that on our own.
Yeah. And then there's the addiction, of course, Bill, a workaholic. Hi, I'm Christy, a codependent.
Yeah.
The addiction to the addict's addiction or to the addict himself. And so that we've got to mention that too, because a lot of our listeners will relate more to codependency.
Yep. And discovering what is it that hooks me? Where are my character defects causing damage to my relationship? and helping people assess that stuff. One of the guys I talked to who's uh, in education around the 12 steps said he'll ask people, how long has it been since you said I'm sorry? And if it's been 15 minutes or less, you probably have real big codependent issues. And it's like, oh, yeah, well, that's pretty good. So
Yeah.
we all have them. And of course, one of the difficulties with the church and spiritual life is some sins are respectable and some are not. Some sins you can do on the inside and some not. Some addictions are respectable and some are not. And so that's where, in many ways, those of us that have been inside the church that have learned how to hide or manage or make them look respectable, we're in bigger trouble.
We are. And that's one of the reasons why I love you writing about how we all need a fully disclosing friend. And of course,
Yes.
Bill and I love that too. That's one of the things, one of the reasons why we promote soul talks,
Yes.
having a fully disclosing talk where you're
Yep.
able to be that honest and really share heart to heart and not and come out of hiding.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more. What are some of the key characteristics of a relationship like this and the benefits that come with it?
Yeah. Part of the beauty of the 12 steps is each one leads directly to another. Uh, the reason they're all written in the past tense is that they worked first for the first 4 years and the first 100 people that got sober. They hadn't been written down yet. People just kept getting into the Oxford group and arranging their life around these practices and becoming sober and free. And it wasn't until 4 years and 100 people that Bill W. sat down and wrote them out. So that's why when you look at it, it's not hard for people in churches to come up with a set of practices to do, but they're often kind of random and not real organic. Um, the fact that these were in the past tense just reflects that they worked and they lead to each other. So I'm powerless. I feel hopeless. Then the next step is hope. Came to believe a power greater than myself. And then that leads to surrender. And then that leads to fearless and searching moral inventory. That sounds like fun. But then we're not done. Once I do a really robust job of that, admitted to God, ourselves, and one other person the exact nature of our wrongs. And that sounds very, very forbidding, for most people. Certainly for me, when I first heard about it, it was like, why would I do that? God has to forgive me. And my big hope is nobody will ever know the terrible things that I've done, and then I can die and go to heaven and nobody will ever know. And uh, many, many folks, part of why I wrote the book was to help people see that if you look at, for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's little book, Life Together, or any wise person writing about spiritual formation, you will see the principles, the steps coming up over and over again. And Bonhoeffer talks about the power that comes when we confess actual concrete sins to a trusted brother or sister.
Mm.
So when I asked my friend Rick to do that for the first time, and took me several weeks to get ready for it, and then I met with them and went through my list, and it took a long, long time. And it was so humiliating for me. And then I never could have predicted what he said to me when I got through with that was, John, I have never loved you more than I love you right now.
Mm.
And uh, what I realized was uh, I can only be loved to the extent that I'm known, because uh, you might say you love me, but as long as I have secrets from you that I'm ashamed of, inevitably I'll think, yeah, but if you knew the secret, you wouldn't love me. So I can only be loved to the extent that I'm known. I can only be fully loved if I'm fully known. That's just a spiritual law of the soul. And it's part of why therapy can be so important for folks, because it's often the first place where somebody can be deeply and totally honest. And when Rick said to me, John, I love you more right now than I have ever loved you, when there was that level of love in the midst of what felt to me like just my ugliness and shame, the old word for that is absolution. I was receiving absolution.
Yes.
We don't
And
use that word much now, but that's what it was. And it's just hugely powerful.
it is. And his response was also deeply empathetic
Yes.
for how exposed you felt in that moment.
Yep.
And it's when we come out of hiding, but even when we're articulating our sin, we can get kind of shrouded in shame. And so that safety and that empathetic response that comes, and then that absorption, that's such a gift from God, mediated through an
Yeah,
ambassador
and
like you.
ironically, I this was many years ago when I first did that with Rick, and I asked him quite recently what prompted him to say those words. And it was very interesting and very ironic. It's the very fact that I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. If folks listening ever do Enneagram kind of stuff, where image and achievement and stuff like that can be some of my addictions. And so it will be always easy for me to try to look like here's something that I know or something that I did. And those things that I'll do because I think they will make me more acceptable, of course, just keep people at a distance. And that
Mhm.
was true with Rick, who is my really, really good friend. And so, ironically, it was the fact that I would be vulnerable with him and let him see the cracks that actually made him say that, not just because he was empathizing with me in my vulnerability and pain. He actually felt more love for me in that moment than he had before because I was coming to him in my weakness and not in my armor.
Mhm.
Um, so if folks are thinking about having a person like that in their life, a fully disclosing friend, it's such a gift. I would not want to try to do life without it. Um, it's not a relationship you can rush into. So you want to give it time. Don't go tell the next person you see, I want to tell you the worst thing I've ever done. Um, you need to look at is somebody trustworthy. I've known people whose lives have been destroyed because they were vulnerable and then somebody abused that vulnerability. Can this person keep confidentiality? Do they have good discernment? Do they rush in to give me advice or something? Are they appropriately vulnerable themselves or do they get self-righteous? And if you're able to find a friend who can do that with you, I think that's wonderful. In AA, often that's a sponsor. Uh, it could be a pastor. It could be a therapist or a clinician, somebody who does that work professionally. But whoever it is, yeah, this step is so powerful that in AA circles, they're right. Very often, it's after taking the fifth step. They will talk about taking the fifth, which has many layers of meaning in AA. But after taking the fifth, that people will find their compulsive desire to drink goes away. That's how powerful it is.
Yeah, that's the power of loving attachment,
Yeah.
being
Yes.
with that fully disclosing friend. And yeah, I mean, we in Soul Share Upbringing, we want all of our listeners, all of our students, all of our spiritual directors to read your book and understand what we're talking about here, because this is really the heart of it, having this kind of a quality of an honest relationship, a grace-based relationship where there's truth and there's empathy, because that's what God uses to heal us of our sin and our addictions. And so I love in your story, John, and when you unpack this in your book, you say that when you were sharing your inventory out loud with Rick, and you were kind of nervous, and you were reading through it, and you had shame, and you weren't kind of nervous. You said you were afraid, understandably, and I can relate to that. And then he said that he loved you. He never loved you more. And he had to say, now look at me. Because that's what happens when we feel shame. We hide. It's just instinctive. We put the fig leaves on. And so there was a saturation that was going on there with the Lord himself there in the room through Rick saying, I love you. I accept you. I want you. I forgive you. Yeah, I see your sin, your brokenness, but I see the good in you. And I love you. I call you mine. And there was something deep in you that was healed there. There was a resonating of receiving that. And
Mhm.
that's what we're looking for in a fully disclosing friend that can be that present with us, and to realize that, Rick is probably realizing, John's having trouble receiving this grace. So let's just slow it down.
Yeah.
And so that's where he just looks at you, I'm sure, with soft eyes, says, now look at me, John. And so very touching. No surprise that you remember this the rest of your life, right?
Yeah. No, uh, its power was huge, and somehow we all know that stuff, and but experiencing it is just different than
Yeah.
knowing it abstractly, and naming um, emotional issues, sexual issues, family, me as a dad, envy, jealousy. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. It's so hard to do, but then once it's done, when you get to the other side of it, it's an incredibly freeing thing. It's just a wonderful
Hmm.
gift to
Yes,
know
it is.
uh, I had the courage to say those things to somebody, and then to receive love back was such a gift.
I've been finding that I need that actually quite often, that I need to stay current with it as I become aware of my sin, of my failures, of my flaws. I'm an Enneagram too. And so that pride can just get in the way and block me. So it really helps me to be able to be honest with myself, with God, and with another person. And I often think, Bill, because you ooze God's grace to me when I do that. And I need that. I need a constant washing of God's grace for me.
Yeah, Rick and I ended up, we now talk every day, Monday through Friday, as long as we're both around, from 6:50 till about 7 o'clock in the morning. How did yesterday go? Where did you mess up? Where do you need help? What are you facing today? And then we pray
Wow.
for each other. And we do that every weekday in the world. And we've done that for several years. And I would not want to go through my days without it. We did that this morning. And I'm just so
Mm,
grateful for that.
Yeah,
mm.
me
That's
too.
great. One of the things you write about as we're moving through the 12 steps is making direct amends and to people that we have harmed, of course. And you delineated 4 categories for making amends that I had not seen before that were very good, that we might need to do it now, later, or maybe never.
Mhm.
And that was a very interesting categorization there because it's giving there's an urgency to it, like
Yep.
now, but then there's like, well, but if everything had to be now, I'd shut down because I can't do it all now. And so
Right.
the pragmatics of those 4 categories, and then of course you teach us, how to do this in a loving way. And so I want to tell a story here because we're in the fellowship of the withered hand. So recently had a situation with needing to make amends to a loved one, and it was a very painful situation for both of us and put a strain and an awkwardness in our relationship. And it was not just humbling for me, it was humiliating for me because we get in these situations in life, all of us, as there's different conflicts or disappointments, rejections, failings, we sin, someone sins against us, different stress points. Satan comes and the demons, they whisper in our ears. And what I was hearing was, well, Bill, what kind of a soul shepherd do you think you are? You teach people how to reconcile, how to heal, how to grow, how to be like Jesus, how to be a loving person, how to be empathetic. And now here with this loved one, you can't even do it, and so and of course I'm an Enneagram 1, so I probably don't even need the
Perfect.
demon to
Yeah.
say that to me. I'm already already going inside there, and yet as I prayed about it and talked to Christy and my safe people about what's going on, I just continued to sense that I needed to wait and to pray. It wasn't, I didn't have your 4 categories, but intuitively I had some of that. And so it was like, it wasn't a now thing. But it was still a wrestle because it went on for more than a couple of years, and it was very, very distressing because it's someone that I'm with and around, and it wasn't like it was all bad. There were still good things in the relationship, but there was an elephant in the room, and that's the way it is when we have a significant unresolved conflict with a loved one or even a coworker. It just feels like there's an elephant in the room, and so as I was praying about this and leaning into the Lord, then there was a window of opportunity that I saw coming and was able to move towards that. And then, in hindsight, as I was reading through what you were teaching, it's like, yeah, these are the things the Lord helped me do in this conversation to make amends because I think, and you were right about this, but anytime we're in this kind of a situation, we sort of feel because relationships are complicated and when I wrong somebody probably I feel wronged as well and so it's
Yep.
so easy to just fall down that slippery slope and just kind of but you and justify things, explain things, defend myself, and so God help me not do that, and I just led with I'm sorry for this and for that and this period of time, and I just want to hear from you what that's been like for you, and to listen to listen with warmth and to ask open questions so we always teach that an apology is essential in these cases. You know, you're taking responsibility, but it's not sufficient because we also need empathy. We need to listen, we need to understand, we need to let that person know that we care and we want to take their perspective in the situation. And as we listen and really learn from them, that shapes our heart to help us actually become different towards them in the future and not repeat that whatever was wrong. And then in this particular situation, there was even opportunity for some mutuality. It was it was part two or three of the conversation, but then I was able to share some of what I felt, not with a finger pointed or judgment, just some of, some of my experience, my emotions, my needs. And then I received empathy back. And so there was a sweet repair and reconciliation, and just to see how God has worked that for good, that, what was broken in some ways, then to be repaired, it's even stronger than before. And so yeah, I'd just love to hear you comment on this area of making amends, because it's such a important, well, we all have relationships where there's conflicts, and then there's sometimes difficult resolving that, and embedded in that, I've probably done something hurtful or something wrong. And so talk to us about making amends.
Yep. It's an area that this in particular, step 8 and 9. 8 is became willing to make amends, made a list of all the persons we've harmed. That's a big list. And you write down each one of the harms. And this step, like step 4, needs to be written down. It just makes it much more concrete. And becoming willing to make amends, I may not be able to, the person may have died, or it might be a situation where the other person is an abusive spouse and they would not be safe to make amends to. So those two steps are separated. The first, just become willing. All right, God, I'm willing to accept the pain of making amends. And then going through the process of deciding, um, is this person in the category of now? Um, Often those are relatively slight things. Um, I withdraw from Nancy or pouch, which is kind of my spiritual gift, or lie, and then I got to go back and make amends for that one. But often they get more complicated, Bill, exactly like you were saying. And so later, maybe I know I need to do this, but I don't quite know how. I don't know what words to say yet. I got to think it through, or I need a little bit more advice, or maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'll, as a pastor, sometimes I've had people come up to me after a sermon and say, Pastor, I just want to apologize to you. I've never really liked you. I liked our old pastor better. I liked his preaching better. I'm sorry. It's like, they didn't really need to say that to me. They probably needed to say that to somebody, but that's not real helpful to me at that moment. So there's times when you might have thought something or had feelings about another person. You don't necessarily need to go to them. So that's that, you know, maybe, maybe not. And it will require wisdom and discernment. And so that's where having a counselor or somebody who's really wise to think through. Now, if I go to make amends to this person, will that be helpful to them, or could it cause more damage than good? And how do I think through that? It's really important to think here, insofar as this is step 8 and step 9, making amends is different than seeking reconciliation. And seeking reconciliation is a very good thing to do. And of course, if I love folks, I will seek to do that. But reconciliation is a two-way street, and that requires the other person's desire and
Mhm.
good faith and an ability to meet on somewhat common ground where we see a situation at least fairly similar to each other. I can still seek to make amends, even if reconciliation is off the table. It's up to the other person if they want to receive my amends or not. And if they don't want to, then I need to honor that and let go of it. But it's still important for me to be willing to and to seek to do that. So for folks who are listening to us, to recognize that there is an important difference between making amends and reconciling. And you can successfully do 8 and 9, even if reconciliation doesn't happen. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to take care of my side of the street. So also, like Bill, in your case, if the other person is open, almost always with conflict. There's two sides, both sides have messed up, both sides, that's almost always the case. And if the other person opens up, and that very often happens, and then you can speak to them about, here's why I was hurt, here's what you did, that's a gift and that's wonderful. But again, for step 8 and 9, I'm not doing that at that point yet. I'm just trying to clean up my house and work on my side of the fence, and and then whatever the outcome is, um, I can know that I have carried out this step. I do think in the church sometimes, because we have misunderstood grace, and we think grace means God has to forgive me no matter what. There's nothing I have to do to earn it. We actually often end up not making amends, and sometimes a misunderstanding of grace where we shrink it down into get out of jail free. We can kind of neglect that instead of recognizing if I love you and I've hurt you, love will always seek to make amends. So it's just what love does. It's not something I have to do to get God to forgive me. It's just what love does.
That's good. Yeah, and especially your distinction between amends and reconciliation. There's a continuum or three categories that might blur together. I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, we can always forgive, and we need to always forgive, and of course be forgiven by the Lord. And then often we can make amends. Whenever it's possible, we want to do that, but we want to make sure it's the loving thing to do for the other person. And being forgiven, forgiving through the Lord helps us with amends when that's possible. And then, as you just said, and my story illustrates, the amends sometimes facilitate a reconciliation. It's a beautiful thing, but of course that takes two people to do that, and it's not always going to work out that way. But forgiveness is always good. Amends is always good when it's possible and right. And then, wow, it's a blessing when we can actually reconcile. But sometimes we're not able to
And
do
that's
that.
why it's important to recognize too, it's always possible to become willing.
Yeah,
That's
good.
why it's so good that that's its own step to get to the place where I say, uh, even if it would cause a lot of pain for me, financial pain or emotional pain or shame, um, I am willing to do that. I'm genuinely willing to do that to help the other person. And then it may not be possible, but in every case, somebody can become willing.
Or be made willing to be willing,
That's
which is
right.
sometimes where it starts
Yes,
for
yes, yes.
me.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you, John. We're so grateful, even in this conversation, in this book, in your ministry, you're living out step 12, where you're practicing and sharing your spiritual awakening and how through these steps and interaction with Jesus, as we walk through them with him, interacting with him, growing in his likeness, we can experience more and more of his grace and power and favor in our lives and flowing through our lives. And that's such a great joy. So friends, we really encourage you to get a copy of Steps by our friend John Ortberg. We will link by our friend John Ortberg, and we will link to this in our show notes as well. Really bless you and the people that you guide as well. And we also encourage you, if you do not have a safe place to work through some of these steps, to be able to be emotionally honest with yourself, God, and others, we do have spiritual directors that you can meet with who we have trained in the 12 steps and who can help you work through, walk this out in your own life as well. We don't want to go through this alone. We can't go through it with them. God has called us together in community, and we're so grateful to be a part of community with you at Soul Shepherding.
John, tell us how our listeners can get a hold of Become New and your book and the other things that you're offering.
Um, yeah, so I do kind of weekly, kind of a daily teaching thing online, and it's at becomenew.com. So if they just Google that, that can get them into it. 10 or 12 minutes of teaching to just help folks grow spiritually a day at a time. And then the book is called Steps. And I think Amazon's had a little trouble keeping it in stock, but I think folks can get it there, or they can go to Become New and I think order it through there. I think they can get it currently through Walmart right now. So that's my best current information. Thank you guys so much. It's a joy to talk to you. I'm very grateful for what you do and kind of feel like we get to partner on the
Yeah,
same team and the same mission, and I'm really glad for that. So it's just kind of cool to have this chance to be together.
wonderful. John, as we close, could you pray for our listeners and just think of that listener? Many of our listeners are missionaries, pastors, small group leaders, disciplers, spiritual directors, coaches, and people that are really in for caring for others. But like Christy said, some of us were struggling with that codependency flavor of addiction.
Mhm. I'd love to. So, Heavenly Father, I pray right now for that one listening to us. And I thank you that we can come to you in our powerlessness and in the midst of our unmanageable lives. And there is one who is greater than ourselves that can watch over us, that can restore us to sanity so that we can live in this world and then ultimately be useful to other people. I pray that you would bring healing. I pray that you would continue to use Bill and Christy and build a mighty army of healing through them and friends and networks and pastors and people in far off places that might feel isolated right now, that they might know I get drunk, but we get sober. We heal together. We do this together. So I pray your blessing on each of us and ask this together in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, John. It's been a joy talking with you,
Thank you. Thank you
praying
all.
with you.
Very
Thank
grateful.
you. Yeah. Bye-bye.